There is a photograph that still circulates among the older generation of football fans. It was taken sometime in the mid-1980s on a sun-drenched afternoon at the old Orange Bowl in Miami, Florida. In the photograph, a young man stands in the pocket, his arm cocked back, his eyes scanning downfield with the calm precision of a surgeon about to make the first incision. His jersey is aqua and white, number 13, and there is something almost effortless about his posture. He does not look like he is struggling against the weight of an oncoming pass rush. He does not look like he is fighting for survival behind a collapsing offensive line. He looks quite simply like a man who was born to throw a football, and in many ways, that is exactly what Dan Marino was. But here is the strange and haunting thing about that photograph, and about so many photographs from that era. If you look closely at the man's face, if you study the expression in his eyes, you will find something beneath the confidence, something quieter than pride, something more fragile than certainty. You will find the faint outline of a question that would follow Dan Marino for the rest of his life. A question that no amount of passing yards, no number of touchdown throws, no record-breaking season could ever fully answer. It is the question that defines him more than any statistic ever could. Can a man be the greatest at what he does and still be remembered for what he never achieved? That is the paradox of Dan Marino. That is the weight he carried from the moment he stepped onto a professional football field until the day he walked away from it. He threw a football with more natural ability than perhaps anyone who had ever played the game. He released the ball faster than defenders could react. He read defenses the way a concert pianist reads sheet music, with an instinct so deep it appeared to bypass conscious thought entirely. And yet, for all of that brilliance, for all of those records that stood for decades, for all of those autumn afternoons when he made the impossible look routine, Dan Marino never won a Super Bowl. He came close once. He came heartbreakingly close, and then the opportunity slipped away, and it never returned. Not because he declined, not because he stopped caring, but because football is not a sport that rewards individual greatness with guaranteed triumph. It is a team game played in a universe of variables that no single arm, no matter how gifted, can fully control. And Dan Marino learned that lesson in the most painful way imaginable. The details of his career are staggering when you lay them out. 17 seasons in the National Football League, all 17 with the Miami Dolphins, more than 61,000 passing yards, 420 touchdown passes, a single-season record of 48 touchdowns that stood for 2 decades, the first quarterback to ever throw for 5,000 yards in a season, a 9-time Pro Bowl selection, the 1984 League Most Valuable Player, first ballot inductee into the Pro Football Hall of Fame in 2005. These are not the numbers of a man who failed. These are the numbers of a man who dominated his position in ways the league had never seen before. And yet, against all logic, these numbers exist alongside a zero. 0 Super Bowl victories, 0 championship rings, 0 parades through the streets of Miami, 0 confetti falling from the sky. By the end of tonight, you are going to understand why Dan Marino remains one of the most fascinating and quietly tragic figures in the history of professional football. You are going to understand why his name still sparks debate in barbershops and sports bars and living rooms across America. You are going to understand why a man who holds some of the most extraordinary passing records in the history of the National Football League is often defined not by what he accomplished, but by the one thing he could never quite reach. And you are going to understand why that absence, that single missing piece, tells us something profound about the nature of greatness itself. This is not simply a football story. This is a story about talent and timing, about brilliance and circumstance, about a man who did everything right and still could not bend the game to his will. It is a story about what happens when the greatest arm in football meets the cold, indifferent mathematics of a sport that does not care how talented you are. It is a story about legacy and what it means to leave behind a body of work that is simultaneously magnificent and incomplete. Before we get started, if you find these stories as moving as we do, take a second to like the video or subscribe. It is a simple action, but it helps this channel reach more people who appreciate the legends of the game. Dan Marino played 17 seasons in the National Football League. He threw for more than 61,000 yards. He threw 420 touchdown passes. He set records that seemed untouchable, records that stood for nearly 2 decades before the modern passing era finally caught up to them. And he did all of it without a championship ring. That is the story. That is the weight. That is the question that has lingered in the air for more than a quarter of a century. Now, let us begin. To understand what Dan Marino meant to the game of football, you first have to understand what the quarterback position looked like before he arrived. You have to go back to the beginning. You have to trace the evolution of the most important position in American professional sports, and you have to see how, piece by piece, era by era, the role of the quarterback was transformed from something modest and functional into something almost mythological. Because Dan Marino did not merely play the quarterback position. He redefined it. He expanded the boundaries of what people believed was possible for a man standing behind center. And to appreciate the magnitude of that contribution, you need to understand the long winding road that led to the moment when he first took the field. In the earliest days of professional football, the quarterback was not the glamorous figure we know today. The game itself was a brutal, ground-based affair, closer to rugby than to the aerial spectacle that modern fans take for granted. In the 1920s and 1930s, when the National Football League was still a loose collection of semi-professional teams playing in small Midwestern cities, the forward pass was viewed with suspicion. It was considered a trick play, a desperate measure used only when the running game had failed. The real men, the warriors, were the ones who carried the ball between the tackles. The quarterback in those early decades was more of a traffic director than a playmaker. He handed the ball off. He called the play. Occasionally, he might throw a short pass if the situation demanded it. But the idea that a quarterback could win a game primarily through the air was considered, by most football men of that era, to be something close to heresy. The game in those early years operated under a formation known as the single wing, which placed the emphasis squarely on the running attack. The ball was snapped directly to a tailback or a fullback, and the quarterback, if you could call him that, was often little more than a blocking back. Passing was rare, inaccurate, and frequently intercepted. The footballs themselves were larger and rounder than the ones used today, making them difficult to grip and throw with any kind of spiral. The rules penalized incomplete passes, which discouraged coaches from taking risks through the air. Football, in its infancy, was a game of brute force and territorial conquest. It was a game of inches, not yards, and the idea that a single player, standing behind center of the offensive line, could determine the outcome of a contest with the strength of his arm was laughable to most of the men who ran the sport. The first cracks in that orthodoxy appeared in the 1930s when a passer named Arnie Herber began throwing the ball downfield for the Green Bay Packers with a frequency that startled the football establishment. Herber was not a polished technician. His mechanics were crude by modern standards, and his accuracy was inconsistent. But he could throw the ball far, and his coach, the legendary Curly Lambeau, was one of the first men in professional football to recognize that the forward pass could be more than just a last resort. Lambeau built an offense that featured the pass as a primary weapon, and the Packers won championships because of it. In 1936, Herber led the league in passing and helped Green Bay claim the NFL title. It was a small revolution, confined mostly to one team, but it planted a seed that would eventually transform the entire sport. Around the same time, another passer was emerging who would push the position even further. Sammy Baugh, who arrived in Washington in 1937, was arguably the first modern quarterback. Baugh could throw with accuracy on short routes and long routes alike. He could read defenses before the snap and adjust his targets accordingly. He led the league in passing 6 times during his 16-year career, an astonishing feat for any era. In his rookie season, he threw for more than 1,000 yards, a remarkable total for that time, and led Washington to the NFL championship. Baugh's career, which stretched from the late 1930s into the early 1950s, served as proof of concept. He showed the football world that the passing game was not a gimmick, it was the future. His influence cannot be overstated. Before Barr, the quarterback was an afterthought. After Barr, he was a contender for the most important player on the field. But even as Barr was rewriting the rules of what a quarterback could be, the position remained limited by the tactical thinking of the time. Offenses in the 1940s and early 1950s were still fundamentally conservative. The run game dominated most playbooks. Play calling was rigid and predictable, built around a handful of formations that had not changed significantly in decades. Quarterbacks were expected to manage the game, not to win it single-handedly. They were expected to hand off the ball on most plays, to throw only when the situation demanded it, and to avoid mistakes above all else. The idea of a quarterback as the central figure of an offense, the man around whom everything revolved, was still decades away from realization. The introduction of the T formation in the late 1930s and early 1940s represented a significant tactical evolution. In this formation, the quarterback lined up directly behind the center and took the snap from under center rather than receiving it in the shotgun or single wing alignment. This gave the quarterback greater control over the play, allowing him to hand off, keep the ball, or drop back to pass with more efficiency. The Chicago Bears, under coach George Halas, popularized the T4 formation and used it to devastating effect, destroying the Washington team 73-0 in the 1940 championship game. That game, one of the most lopsided in NFL history, demonstrated the potential of the modern offensive formation. But it was the running game, not the passing game, that drove the Bears' dominance that day. The quarterback was still, in the eyes of most coaches, a facilitator rather than a star. The next great leap forward came in the 1950s, with the arrival of two quarterbacks who would change the position forever. The first was Otto Graham, who played for the Cleveland Browns from 1946 to 1955. Graham was a winner in the purest sense of the word. He led the Browns to 10 consecutive championship games, winning 7 of them. His passing numbers were excellent for the era, and his ability to lead his team in crucial moments was unmatched. Graham was not flashy, he was not a gunslinger, but he was efficient, intelligent, and relentlessly competitive, and his sustained excellence over a decade-long career established a new standard for what a franchise quarterback could achieve. The second, and perhaps more influential, was Johnny Unitas. Unitas arrived in Baltimore in 1956, a cast-off who had been cut by the Pittsburgh Steelers and was playing semi-professional football for $6 a game when the Colts gave him a chance. Within 2 years, he was the best quarterback in professional football. Unitas changed everything. He changed the way quarterbacks prepared for games. He changed the way they communicated with their teammates. He changed the way they commanded the huddle. And most importantly, he changed the way the public perceived the position. Before Unitas, quarterbacks were respected but not celebrated in the way that running backs and defensive players were. After Unitas, the quarterback became the face of the franchise, the most important player on the roster, the man whose name appeared in the headlines and whose image appeared on magazine covers. Unitas played with a confidence that bordered on arrogance, but it was the confidence of a man who had done the work. He studied film obsessively. He memorized defensive tendencies. He understood the geometry of the field in a way that allowed him to anticipate where defenders would be before they got there. And his arm, while not the strongest in the league, was precise and reliable. He set a record by throwing at least one touchdown pass in 47 consecutive games, a streak that stood for more than 5 decades. The 1958 championship game between the Baltimore Colts and the New York Giants, often called the greatest game ever played, was Unitas' masterpiece. He led the Colts on a late drive that tied the game and then won it in overtime, and in doing so, he did not merely win a championship. He elevated the quarterback position to a level of cultural significance it had never before achieved. That game was broadcast on national television, and millions of Americans watched Unitas orchestrate a victory that transformed football from a regional pastime into a national obsession. In the decade that followed, other quarterbacks built on the foundation that Unitas had established. Bart Starr, the quiet and methodical signal caller for Vince Lombardi's Green Bay Packers, won the first 2 Super Bowls and demonstrated that a quarterback did not need to be flashy to be effective. Starr was the ultimate game manager, a man who rarely made mistakes, who executed Lombardi's system with precision and intelligence, and who elevated his play in the biggest moments. He was named the most valuable player of both Super Bowl I and Super Bowl II, cementing his legacy as one of the great big-game quarterbacks in history. The 1970s also saw the emergence of Ken Stabler, the left-handed quarterback, who led the Oakland Raiders with a rebellious spirit and a gunslinger's mentality. Stabler was everything the NFL establishment distrusted. He played by instinct rather than by the playbook. He trusted his arm in situations where more cautious quarterbacks would have chosen to run the ball or throw it away. He lived hard off the field and played harder on it. And in 1976, he led the Raiders to a Super Bowl championship, throwing with a reckless accuracy that left defenders grasping at air. Stabler's career was a reminder that the quarterback position could accommodate many different personalities and many different styles of play. There was no single template for greatness. There were only results. Bob Grease, the quarterback of the undefeated 1972 Miami Dolphins, represented yet another archetype. Grease was the ultimate game manager, a term that is sometimes used dismissively, but that in Grease's case was a testament to his intelligence and discipline. He did not throw for gaudy statistics. He did not make highlight reel plays. He simply managed the flow of the game with a quiet efficiency that allowed the Dolphins' powerful running attack to function at its peak. Grease's career with Miami is relevant to the Marino story for an obvious reason. When Marino arrived in Miami a decade later, he inherited a franchise that had been built on the principles of ball control and defensive toughness. He would transform that franchise into something entirely different, something that bore almost no resemblance to the methodical, ground-based team that Grease had quarterbacked to perfection. The relationship between the quarterback and the rules of the game is another critical thread in this history. Throughout the 1960s and 1970s, the rules of professional football heavily favored the defense. Defensive backs were permitted to make contact with receivers for the entire length of their routes, a practice known as bump-and-run coverage that effectively allowed defenders to physically manhandle the men they were guarding. Pass interference was called inconsistently. Roughing the passer was rarely flagged unless the hit was flagrantly late or obviously dangerous. The playing fields were often in poor condition, with torn-up turf and uneven surfaces that made precise route running difficult. The footballs were harder to grip in cold weather and rain. Everything about the game, from the rules to the equipment to the playing surfaces, conspired against the passing attack. This began to change in 1978, when the NFL Competition Committee implemented a series of rule changes that would have profound and lasting consequences for the quarterback position. The most significant of these changes was the so-called Mel Blount rule, named after the Pittsburgh Steelers' dominant cornerback, which prohibited defenders from making contact with receivers beyond 5 yards from the line of scrimmage. This single rule change opened up the passing game in ways that the league's founders could never have anticipated. Suddenly, receivers could run their routes without being physically impeded by defenders. Suddenly, timing patterns became viable, because quarterbacks could trust that their receivers would be in the right place at the right time without being knocked off course. Suddenly, the geometry of the passing game, the precise angles and distances that separate a completion from an incompletion, became something that could be planned and executed with consistency. These rule changes did not produce immediate results. It took several years for coaches and offensive coordinators to fully understand the implications of the new rules and to design offensive systems that exploited them. But by the early 1980s, the effects were becoming visible. Passing totals were rising across the league. Quarterbacks were throwing more frequently and more accurately, and the stage was being set for a player who would take advantage of these new rules in ways that no one had imagined possible. That player was Dan Marino. Joe Namath, who arrived in the American Football League in 1965, brought a different dimension to the position entirely. Namath was charismatic, brash, and supremely confident. He guaranteed victory in Super Bowl III and then delivered on that promise, leading the New York Jets to a stunning upset of the heavily favored Baltimore Colts. Namath's significance extended far beyond his statistics, which were impressive but not otherworldly. He was the first quarterback who was as famous for his personality as he was for his play on the field. He appeared on television shows. He wore fur coats. He dated movie stars. He brought a swagger and celebrity to the position that transcended the sport itself, and his success in Super Bowl III helped legitimize the American Football League and pave the way for the merger that created the modern NFL. By the early 1970s, the quarterback position had evolved significantly from its origins in the single-wing formation. Passers were throwing more frequently, offensive coordinators were designing more sophisticated passing schemes, and the rules of the game were beginning to shift in favor of the offensive player. But even in this evolving landscape, the run game still dominated. Teams like the Miami Dolphins, who completed a perfect season in 1972, did so primarily on the strength of their rushing attack, powered by Larry Csonka, Mercury Morris, and Jim Keeck. The Pittsburgh Steelers, who won 4 Super Bowls in the 1970s, were built around a ferocious defense, the legendary Steel Curtain, and a punishing ground game. Terry Bradshaw, the Steelers' quarterback, was a talented passer with a strong arm, but he was not asked to carry the offense the way modern quarterbacks are. He was a piece of the puzzle, an important piece, but a piece nonetheless. The real revolution in quarterbacking came in the late 1970s and early 1980s, and it came from an unlikely source. Bill Walsh, the head coach of the San Francisco 49ers, developed an offensive system that would come to be known as the West Coast offense. Walsh's system was built on a simple but radical premise. Instead of using the running game to set up the pass, he would use the pass to set up the run. His offense emphasized short, precise passes thrown in rhythm. It used the passing game as an extension of the running game, stretching defenses horizontally and creating mismatches in space. The quarterback in Walsh's system was not a gunslinger heaving the ball downfield on every play. He was a chess master making quick reads, delivering the ball on time to predetermined targets, and allowing his receivers and running backs to gain yards after the catch. Joe Montana, Walsh's quarterback, was the perfect instrument for this system. Montana was not the biggest quarterback, standing just over 6 feet tall. He did not have the strongest arm in the league. His physical tools, while adequate, were not exceptional by NFL standards. But he was extraordinarily accurate. He was calm under pressure in a way that almost defied explanation, and he had an intuitive understanding of Walsh's offense that allowed him to execute it at a level that no one else could match. Montana won 4 Super Bowls with the 49ers, compiling a perfect 4-0 record on the biggest stage. His partnership with Walsh fundamentally altered the way offenses were constructed in the National Football League. Coaches across the league studied Walsh's system and adopted elements of it, and the passing game began to assume a prominence it had never before enjoyed. Roger Staubach, who played for the Dallas Cowboys throughout the 1970s, deserves mention in any discussion of the quarterbacking evolution. Staubach was a dual-threat quarterback before the term existed, capable of hurting defenses with his arm and his legs. He won 2 Super Bowls and earned a reputation as one of the most clutch performers in NFL history. His nickname, Captain Comeback, reflected his ability to rally his team from deficits in the fourth quarter with a combination of poise, athleticism, and sheer competitive will. Staubach's career overlapped with Bradshaw's, and the rivalry between the Cowboys and the Steelers in the 1970s produced some of the greatest Super Bowls in history. But here is the crucial detail, the piece of context that makes Dan Marino's story so extraordinary. While Walsh and Montana were perfecting the West Coast offense, while the league was slowly moving toward a more pass-oriented style of play, while coaches were learning to appreciate the value of timing routes and quick-release passing, Dan Marino was doing something entirely different in Miami. He was not playing in a sophisticated West Coast system. He was not relying on short, timing-based passes to move the ball methodically down the field. He was doing something far more radical and far more dangerous. He was throwing the ball downfield with a velocity and accuracy that the league had simply never seen before. He was releasing the ball so quickly that pass rushers could not reach him. He was reading defenses so efficiently that he was delivering the ball before receivers had even completed their routes. And he was doing it in a way that was so natural, so instinctive, so breathtakingly efficient, that it made every other quarterback in the league look like they were operating in slow motion. The quarterback position, by the time Marino arrived in the National Football League in 1983, had come a long way from the days of Arnie Herber and the single wing formation. It had evolved through Barg's precision, Graham's consistency, Unitas's command, Namath's charisma, Starr's discipline, Staubach's versatility, and Montana's cool efficiency. But Marino represented something new, something that did not fit neatly into the existing categories. He was not a game manager. He was not a system quarterback. He was not a dual-threat athlete who could hurt you with his legs. He was, quite simply, the purest passer the game had ever produced. His arm was a weapon unlike anything the league had seen. Not just strong, though it was that. Not just accurate, though it was that too. It was quick. The release. The time between the moment the ball left his hand and the moment it arrived at its target was shorter than anyone could account for. Defensive coordinators studied film and devised schemes, and Marino rendered them all irrelevant with the flick of his wrist. To understand how radical this was, you have to understand the context of the 1983 NFL Draft, one of the most celebrated quarterback drafts in the history of the league. 6 quarterbacks were selected in the first round that year. John Elway went first overall to the Baltimore Colts, who immediately traded him to the Denver Broncos after Elway refused to play for the organization. Todd Blackledge went 7th to the Kansas City Chiefs. Jim Kelly went 14th to the Buffalo Bills, though he initially chose to play in the United States Football League instead. Tony Eason went 15th to the New England Patriots. Ken O'Brien went 24th to the New York Jets. And Dan Marino, the kid from Pittsburgh who had been projected as a top 5 pick before a mysterious and devastating slide, went 27th overall to the Miami Dolphins. 26 teams passed on Dan Marino. Some of them needed a quarterback desperately. Some of them would spend the next decade searching for the kind of player they could have had that day. The reasons for Marino's slide are still debated to this day. There were whispered concerns about his character, unfounded rumors about off-the-field behavior that were never substantiated by any credible source. There were questions about his senior season at the University of Pittsburgh, where his numbers had dipped slightly from the extraordinary heights of his junior year. And there was, perhaps most tellingly, a general consensus among the scouting community that Marino's style of play was too reliant on the passing game. He could not run. He was not mobile. In an era when many coaches still valued a quarterback who could extend plays with his legs, Marino's lack of mobility was seen as a serious liability. But Don Shula, the legendary coach of the Miami Dolphins, saw something different. Shula, who had coached Johnny Unitas in Baltimore during the early part of his career and who understood the quarterback position as well as anyone alive, watched Marino's film and saw a player whose arm talent was so exceptional that mobility was irrelevant. Shula did not need Marino to run. He needed Marino to throw. He needed a man who could stand in the pocket and deliver the football to its target before the defense could react. And he saw, in the raw footage of Marino's college career, exactly that man. When Marino arrived in Miami, he entered a franchise with a proud history. The Dolphins had won back-to-back Super Bowls in the early 1970s, including the only perfect season in NFL history in 1972. They had been led by Bob Grease, a smart and efficient quarterback who managed the game brilliantly, but was never confused with a gunslinger. The Dolphins of the early 70s were a running team, powered by Larry Csonka and Mercury Morris, coached by the incomparable Shula. The passing game was an afterthought, a complement to the rushing attack that churned out yards and consumed the clock. Marino changed all of that in a matter of weeks. From the moment he took the field for his first professional start, it was clear that the Miami Dolphins were going to be a fundamentally different kind of team. The running game, which had been the foundation of Miami's identity for over a decade, became secondary almost immediately. The passing game became the engine, the identity, the reason for being. And Marino, with his impossibly quick release and his preternatural ability to read defenses, became the most dangerous offensive player in professional football. The evolution of the quarterback position, from the days of leather helmets and single-wing formations to the era of sophisticated passing attacks and million-dollar arms, had been a long and gradual process. It had taken decades of innovation, experimentation, and rule changes to create the conditions under which a player like Marino could thrive. But when he arrived, he did not merely take advantage of those conditions. He transcended them. He pushed the position forward by a generation. He threw for numbers that seemed impossible in the context of his time. He set records that the football world believed would stand forever. He demonstrated, more clearly than any player before him, that the quarterback position was the single most important position in all of professional sports. And he did it all without winning the one thing that, in the eyes of many, separates the truly great from the merely brilliant. He did it all without a championship. That is the deeper story that awaits us now. The story of a man who was, by almost any measure, the most talented passer of his generation, and perhaps of any generation, who spent 17 years chasing a prize that always remained just beyond his reach. Daniel Constantine Marino Jr. was born on September 15th, 1961, in the city of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. He was the first of 3 children born to Daniel Marino Sr. and Veronica Marino, a couple of Italian and Polish descent who lived in the Oakland neighborhood of Pittsburgh. Oakland sat in the shadow of the University of Pittsburgh campus and was a place of row houses and narrow streets, corner bars, and neighborhood churches. It was a working-class enclave, the kind of place where families knew each other by name, where doors were left unlocked and children played in the streets until the streetlights came on. It was a neighborhood that measured success, not in dollars, but in the respect of one's neighbors. And it was a neighborhood that produced, as such neighborhoods so often do, a particular kind of athlete. Tough, resilient, fiercely competitive, and deeply rooted in the values of hard work, loyalty, and the belief that what you did with your hands mattered more than what you said with your mouth. Dan Marino Sr. worked as a delivery driver for the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, the city's daily newspaper. He rose before dawn most mornings, loaded his truck, and drove his route through the still dark streets of Pittsburgh, dropping bundles of newspapers at doorsteps and storefronts across the city. It was physical work, honest work, the kind of work that built calluses on the hands and aches in the lower back. He came home tired most evenings, but he was never too tired to play catch with his son in the small yard behind their house. The elder Marino was an athlete himself, a man who had played baseball and football in his youth, and who understood the discipline and sacrifice required to excel in competitive sports. He did not push his son toward athletics so much as he created an environment in which athletics were a natural extension of daily life. Sports were the language of the household. They were the bond between father and son. The younger Marino showed athletic ability from an early age. He was coordinated and quick, with large hands and a natural feel for ball sports that set him apart from his peers even in grade school. He played baseball, and he was exceptionally good at it. He was a strong-armed pitcher with excellent hand-eye coordination, and professional baseball scouts would eventually take notice of his talent on the diamond. The Kansas City Royals would select him in the 4th round of the 1979 Major League Baseball draft. A selection that speaks to the breadth of his athletic gifts, but it was football that captured his imagination and held it fast. Pittsburgh in the 1970s was a football city in the deepest and most consuming sense of the word. The Steelers were in the midst of their dynasty, winning 4 Super Bowls between 1974 and 1979, behind a roster loaded with Hall of Famers. Terry Bradshaw, Franco Harris, Mean Joe Green, Jack Lambert, Lynn Swann, John Stallworth. These names were spoken with reverence in the homes and taverns of Pittsburgh, and for a young boy growing up in Oakland, there was no greater aspiration than to someday wear the black and gold. Marino attended Central Catholic High School, a private Catholic school in the Oakland neighborhood, that had a proud and storied football tradition. The school had produced several college and professional players, and its football program was regarded as one of the best in the city. It was at Central Catholic that Marino first began to demonstrate the arm talent that would eventually make him famous across the country. His high school coach, a man named Brad Jett, recognized immediately that Marino was not an ordinary high school quarterback. There was a quality to his throwing motion that was different from anything Jett had seen before. The ball came out of Marino's hand with a speed and tightness that seemed impossible for a teenager. His release was already compact and efficient, a quick flick of the wrist that propelled the ball on a line to its target. His footwork was instinctive, his ability to set his feet and transfer power from his lower body to his arm happening almost without conscious effort, and his ability to throw with accuracy while under pressure, a skill that many professional quarterbacks never fully develop over the course of an entire career, was already evident at the age of 16. Marino led Central Catholic to the Western Pennsylvania Interscholastic Athletic League Championship in his senior year, throwing for impressive numbers against some of the best high school defenses in the state. He was named a Parade All-American, one of the highest honors a high school football player could receive at that time. College recruiters from across the country descended on Oakland, offering scholarships and making promises about playing time and national championships. Clemson wanted him. Arizona State wanted him. Several schools in the Big Ten reached out, but Marino never seriously considered leaving Pittsburgh. The University of Pittsburgh was in his backyard, literally a few blocks from the house where he had grown up. The Panthers were building a nationally competitive program under head coach Jackie Sherrill, who had assembled a talented roster and was beginning to turn Pitt into a legitimate contender for national prominence. For Marino, the choice was simple and immediate. He would stay home, play for Pitt, and see how far his arm could take him. He arrived at the University of Pittsburgh in the fall of 1979, and the adjustment to college football was smoother than anyone had a right to expect. He was inserted into the lineup as a freshman and showed flashes of the talent that would make him a first-round pick. By the time he was a sophomore, he was already one of the best quarterbacks in college football, throwing for more than 2,000 yards and earning national attention for his performances against top-ranked opponents. His ability to throw the ball into tight windows, to fit passes between defenders with a precision that seemed almost supernatural, was already becoming his signature. Defensive coordinators who faced Pitt began to game plan specifically for Marino's arm, and they discovered, to their frustration, that there was no reliable way to stop it. Double coverage did not deter him. Blitzing did not rattle him. He stood in the pocket, set his feet, and threw the ball where it needed to go, over and over again, with a calm that seemed almost inhuman. His 1981 season was extraordinary by any standard. He threw for more than 2,500 yards and led Pitt to an 11-1 record, the lone loss coming to Penn State in a game that was decided by a single play. The Panthers finished the season ranked 4th in the country, and Marino was widely regarded as one of the top NFL prospects in the nation. His arm strength, his quick release, his ability to read coverages and deliver the ball with pinpoint accuracy, all of these qualities marked him as a generational talent. NFL scouts who attended Pitt's games came away shaking their heads in disbelief. They had seen strong arms before. They had seen accurate passes before, but they had never seen the combination of arm strength, release speed, and football intelligence that Marino possessed. He was, in the parlance of the scouting world, a once-in-a-generation prospect. His junior season, also in 1981, was even better. Pitt went 11-1 again, finishing the year with a dominating victory in the Sugar Bowl over a highly ranked Georgia team. Marino was spectacular throughout the season, throwing with a confidence and precision that left opposing defenses utterly helpless. He was projected as a certain top 5 pick in the upcoming NFL draft, and many analysts believed he would be the first overall selection. He was compared to the greatest quarterbacks in the history of the game, and the comparisons did not seem outlandish. At the age of 20, Dan Marino appeared to be a player without a ceiling, a talent so profound that the only question was not whether he would be great at the professional level, but how great. But then came his senior season, and this is where the story takes its first unexpected and consequential turn. Marino's statistics dipped in 1982. His completion percentage dropped. His interception totals rose. Pitt's record slipped to 9-3. Still a respectable season by any objective measure, but a clear step backward from the heights of the previous 2 years. The Panthers lost games they were expected to win, and Marino's performance, while still excellent compared to most college quarterbacks, was not at the transcendent level it had been in previous campaigns. The magic seemed to have dimmed, if only slightly. Scouts and analysts who had watched him dominate for 3 years now began to whisper. They questioned his consistency. They wondered if the junior year performance had been a peak he could not sustain. They scrutinized his footwork, his decision-making, his body language in the pocket. They found flaws that they had not noticed before, or that they had overlooked when the numbers were more impressive. And then, in the weeks leading up to the 1983 draft, a different kind of whisper began to circulate. Rumors, vague and unsubstantiated, about Marino's personal life. Suggestions of recreational behavior that concerned NFL teams. The specifics of these rumors varied depending on who was telling the story, and none of them were ever confirmed by any credible source. Marino himself denied them emphatically. But in the world of professional football, where franchises invest millions of dollars in their first-round picks, and where character concerns can outweigh raw talent in the minds of cautious general managers, the whispers were enough to create doubt. And so Dan Marino, who had been projected as the top pick in the draft just 12 months earlier, began to slide. Team after team passed on him. The Colts took Elway at number 1. The Houston Oilers took guard Mike Munchak at number 8, passing on a quarterback entirely. The Bears took wide receiver Willie Gault. The Seahawks, the Lions, the Chargers. One by one they selected other players, other positions, other futures. Marino sat in the green room at the draft venue, watching his name remain on the board, feeling the anxiety build with each pick that did not belong to him. His family sat beside him. His mother held his hand. The cameras caught the strain on his face, the effort he made to maintain composure as the dream he had worked toward his entire life seemed to be slipping away. And it gets harder, because Marino was not just being passed over by teams that did not need a quarterback. He was being passed over by teams that desperately needed one. The Chiefs took Todd Blackledge at number 7. Blackledge would go on to have a brief and unremarkable NFL career, never living up to his first-round billing. The Bills took Jim Kelly at number 14. Kelly was an excellent quarterback who would eventually lead Buffalo to 4 consecutive Super Bowl appearances. But even Kelly's advocates would concede that he did not possess Marino's arm talent. The Patriots took Tony Eason at number 15. Eason would have a mediocre career and would be benched in Super Bowl XX. The Jets took Ken O'Brien at number 24. O'Brien had some productive seasons, but never approached the level of play that Marino would achieve. 4 quarterbacks were selected before Marino in the first round of the 1983 draft, and history would prove, definitively and emphatically, that none of them possessed his talent. Finally, mercifully, at the 27th pick, Don Shula and the Miami Dolphins made the call. Shula, who was 60 years old, and who had spent his entire adult life coaching football at the highest level, who had won Super Bowls and coached legends, and understood the quarterback position more intimately than perhaps any man alive, saw in Marino something that 26 other organizations had either missed or chosen to ignore. He saw a passer of rare and transcendent ability. He saw a young man with the arm strength, the release speed, the football intelligence, and the competitive fire to be the centerpiece of an offense for the next decade and beyond. And he made the pick that would define the final chapter of his own legendary coaching career. Marino arrived in Miami and was given time to learn the offense during the early weeks of his rookie season. The starting quarterback was David Woodley, a capable but limited player who had led the Dolphins to the Super Bowl 2 years earlier. But Woodley struggled early in the 1983 season, and Shula, recognizing what he had in his rookie, inserted Marino into the starting lineup in Week 6. From that moment forward, Marino was the Dolphins' quarterback. From that moment forward, nothing about the Miami Dolphins would be the same. He played well from the very beginning, throwing for more than 2,200 yards in just 11 starts as a rookie. He showed no signs of the inconsistency that scouts had worried about. He showed no signs of the character concerns that had caused his draft stock to plummet. He was poised, confident, and devastatingly effective, completing passes at a rate that was exceptional for a first-year player. He led the Dolphins to the playoffs and threw for 262 yards in a postseason win over the New England Patriots. The performance served notice to the rest of the league. The young man from Pittsburgh was not merely good, he was special. He was generationally, historically, unmistakably special. But his rookie season, impressive as it was merely a prologue, a hint of what was coming, a small taste of the feast that would follow. Because what came next was one of the single greatest seasons any quarterback has ever played in the history of professional football. What came next was 1984. In his second year in the league, Dan Marino put together a season that defied comprehension and redefined the boundaries of the quarterback position. He threw for 5,084 yards, becoming the first quarterback in NFL history to surpass the 5,000-yard mark in a single season. He threw 48 touchdown passes, shattering the previous record of 36 set by Y.A. Tittle in 1963, more than 2 decades earlier. He completed 64.2% of his passes, an extraordinary accuracy rate for any era. He posted a passer rating of 108.9, the highest in the league. He led the Dolphins to a 14-2 regular season record, the best mark in the American Football Conference, and he was named the league's most valuable player at the age of 23, making him one of the youngest players to ever receive the honor. Marino's ability to read defenses was not something that could be easily quantified, but it was perhaps his most valuable skill. Before each snap, he would survey the defensive alignment, noting the positioning of the safeties, the depth of the cornerbacks, the stance of the linebackers. He would process this information in a fraction of a second, compare it to the offensive play that had been called, and make adjustments at the line of scrimmage if necessary. His pre-snap reads were so accurate that by the time the ball was snapped, he already knew where he was going to throw it. The post-snap read, the moment when the quarterback sees the defense react to the play and makes his final decision, was almost instantaneous for Marino. Other quarterbacks needed 2 or 3 seconds to go through their progressions, scanning from their first read to their second to their third before finding the open receiver. Marino often threw to his first read, and he was right far more often than he was wrong. This was not luck. It was not guesswork. It was the product of thousands of hours of film study, thousands of repetitions in practice, and an intuitive understanding of defensive football that bordered on the uncanny. His footwork in the pocket was another element that separated him from his contemporaries. Despite his lack of mobility outside the pocket, Marino was extraordinarily nimble within it. He could make subtle adjustments with his feet, sliding a step to the left or right to avoid a rushing defender, resetting his base in a fraction of a second to deliver a throw from a different angle. His ability to manipulate the pocket without leaving it was a skill that few quarterbacks before him had possessed, and it was one of the reasons his sack totals were relatively low, despite playing behind offensive lines that were not always excellent. He did not need to run away from pressure. He simply stepped around it, like a matador sidestepping a charging bull, and delivered the ball with his characteristic quickness before the defense could recover. The chemistry between Marino and his receivers during the 1984 season was electric and deeply intertwined. Mark Clayton and Mark Duper, the Marks brothers, were both fast and fluid route runners who had an almost telepathic connection with their quarterback. Clayton was the more physical of the two, willing to go over the middle and absorb hits from linebackers and safeties. Duper was the deep threat, a burner who could stretch the field vertically and force safeties to respect the long ball. Together, they gave Marino options on every play, and Marino exploited those options with a precision that was surgical. There were games during that 1984 season when opposing defensive coordinators would later admit, in interviews and film sessions, that there was simply nothing they could do. They had game planned for Marino's quick release. They had schemed against the Marx brothers' routes. They had brought pressure from every angle and dropped defenders into every zone. And Marino had carved them apart anyway, because his ability to process the defense and deliver the ball was operating at a level that no defensive scheme could account for. The numbers were staggering, not merely because they were the best in the league that year, but because they were the best the league had ever seen. No quarterback had ever thrown for that many yards in a single season. No quarterback had ever thrown that many touchdown passes, and no quarterback had ever done it with such apparent ease, such fluidity, such a total absence of strain or struggle. Marino made it look effortless. He made the most difficult thing in professional sports, throwing a football accurately under pressure against the best defenders in the world, look as natural as breathing. What made Marino's 1984 season so remarkable was not merely the statistical output, though the statistics were historic. It was the manner in which he produced those numbers. His release was so quick that defensive coordinators simply could not design a pass rush capable of reaching him before the ball left his hand. The average quarterback of that era held the ball for approximately 3 seconds before throwing, and many held it for closer to 4. Marino was consistently releasing the ball in under 2 seconds, sometimes in less than 1.5 seconds. By the time the pass rushers arrived at the spot where the quarterback was supposed to be standing, the ball was already 20 or 30 yards downfield, spiraling perfectly into the waiting hands of Mark Clayton or Mark Duper, the two dynamic receivers who formed the most feared receiving duo in the entire league. Clayton caught 73 passes for 1,389 yards and 18 touchdowns that season. Duper added 71 catches for 1,306 yards and 8 touchdowns. Together, the Marx brothers, as they were known, terrorized defensive backfields across the NFL, running precise routes and trusting that Marino's arm would deliver the ball exactly where it needed to be. And it always did. The Dolphins marched through the 1984 playoffs with a confidence that bordered on invincibility. They defeated the Seattle Seahawks in the divisional round, with Marino throwing for 262 yards and 3 touchdowns in a commanding victory. Then they dismantled the Pittsburgh Steelers, Marino's hometown team, in the AFC Championship game, playing against the franchise he had grown up idolizing, the franchise that had never given him a chance. Marino threw for 421 yards and 4 touchdowns in a 45-28 rout that was over almost before it started. When the final whistle blew that afternoon, the Miami Dolphins were headed to Super Bowl XIX. They would face the San Francisco 49ers, the defending champions, and their quarterback, Joe Montana, in a matchup that was billed as the ultimate showdown between the two best quarterbacks in professional football. And this is where the story turns. This is where the fairy tale comes to its abrupt and devastating end. This is where the long, painful reality of Dan Marino's career truly begins. Because Super Bowl XIX, played on January 20th, 1985, at Stanford Stadium in Palo Alto, California, was supposed to be Marino's coronation. It was supposed to be the moment when the greatest single season by a quarterback in the history of the National Football League was capped with the greatest possible prize. It was supposed to be the beginning of a dynasty. The young quarterback, the record-breaking arm, the franchise that had found its savior. It was supposed to be the start of something that would last for a decade or more. Instead, it was a humiliation. The 49ers, coached by the brilliant Bill Walsh and quarterbacked by the unflappable Joe Montana, demolished the Dolphins 38-16. It was not close. It was not competitive for more than the first quarter. San Francisco's defense, which had been largely overlooked in the build-up to the game because the media was so focused on the Marino-Montana quarterback duel, completely suffocated the Miami offense. They took away Marino's quick throws with aggressive man-to-man coverage. They pressured him with creative and unpredictable blitz packages. They forced him to hold the ball longer than he was accustomed to holding it, and when he did hold it, they hit him hard. Montana, meanwhile, was brilliant, as he so often was on the biggest stages. He threw for 331 yards and 3 touchdowns, and he ran for 59 yards and another score. He was named the game's most valuable player, and the 49ers celebrated their second Super Bowl championship in 4 years. Marino finished the game with just 1 touchdown pass and 2 interceptions. He was pressured into rush throws. He was flustered by a defensive scheme he had not seen on film. He was, for one of the very few times in his career, outplayed and outclassed. He was 23 years old, standing on the field in Palo Alto as confetti fell for the other team, and the look on his face told the story that words could not. He was devastated. He had come so close, so impossibly, agonizingly close, and it had been taken from him in the most decisive fashion imaginable. In the remaining 15 years of his career, Dan Marino never again played in a Super Bowl. He never again played in a conference championship game until 1992, 7 long years later. And when he finally did reach the AFC Championship game again, he lost badly to the Buffalo Bills. The opportunity that had seemed so certain in January of 1985, the opportunity that a 23-year-old superstar had every logical reason to believe would present itself again and again over the course of a long and brilliant career, proved to be a singular, unrepeatable, never-to-return moment in time, a door that opened, briefly and tantalizingly, and then closed with a permanence that would shadow Marino for the rest of his professional life and beyond. It was not Marino who changed after that Super Bowl loss. His arm did not weaken, his determination did not falter. His understanding of the game continued to deepen with each passing season. He returned in 1985 and threw for more than 4,000 yards again, proving that the Super Bowl loss had not broken his spirit or diminished his ability. He continued to set records, continued to lead the league in passing categories, continued to perform at a level that was demonstrably superior to the vast majority of his peers. The change was not in Marino. The change was in everything around him. The Dolphins' defense, which had been adequate during the Super Bowl run, deteriorated. The coaching staff, while still led by the legendary Shula, did not adapt quickly enough to the changing tactical landscape of the league. The front office made decisions that prioritized the present over the future, trading draft picks and allowing key players to leave in free agency without securing replacements of comparable quality. The organization, in short, failed to build the kind of complete and balanced team that a championship requires. And Marino, alone in the pocket with his magnificent arm and his undiminished competitive fire, was left to carry a burden that no single player, regardless of his talent, could carry to the finish line. But here is what makes this story unforgettable. Dan Marino was 23 years old on the night of Super Bowl XIX. He had every reason to believe that he would be back, that he would have another chance, and another one after that, and another one after that. He was the best quarterback in the game. He was in the earliest stages of his physical prime. He had a brilliant coach in Don Shula. He had talented receivers who were still young. The future, by every reasonable estimation, belonged to him. Not once in the remaining 15 years of his career did Dan Marino return to the Super Bowl. Not once did he play in the game that had defined and ultimately defeated him as a 23-year-old. The opportunity that seemed so certain in January of 1985, the opportunity that a 23-year-old superstar had every right to believe would come again and again and again, proved to be a once-in-a-lifetime moment. A door that opened, briefly and tantalizingly, and then shut with a finality that would follow Marino for the rest of his days. The years that followed Super Bowl XIX were not unkind to Dan Marino as an individual performer. He remained one of the best quarterbacks in the National Football League for the better part of a decade after that loss, a perennial Pro Bowl selection, a player whose arm could still change the trajectory of any game on any given Sunday afternoon. But the years were complicated. They were marked by moments of individual brilliance that existed alongside a persistent and deepening team-wide frustration, a sense that the roster around him was never quite good enough to return him to the place where he most desperately wanted to be. And as the seasons accumulated, as the records piled up and the championship drought lengthened, The narrative around Dan Marino began to shift in ways that were both unfair and inescapable. He was no longer the young phenomenon destined for greatness. He was becoming something else entirely. He was becoming, in the eyes of many, the greatest quarterback who could not win the big one. The first great challenge of Marino's post-Super Bowl career came in the 1985 season, the year immediately following the devastating loss to San Francisco. The Dolphins were widely expected to contend for the championship again. They still had Marino, whose arm showed no signs of declining. They still had the Marks brothers, Clayton and Duper, who remained one of the most explosive receiving tandems in the game. They still had Don Shula, who was one of the greatest coaches in the history of professional football, and who had a track record of keeping his teams competitive year after year. But the defense, which had been exposed so brutally in the Super Bowl, remained a fundamental weakness. The Dolphins had not invested adequately in their defensive personnel during the off-season. They had not addressed the pass rush, which was anemic. They had not upgraded the secondary, which had been torched by Montana and the San Francisco receivers. They had, in essence, come back with the same team that had been demolished on the biggest stage, hoping that Marino's arm could compensate for the deficiencies that the Super Bowl had laid bare. The Dolphins went 12-4 in the regular season, a record that would be the envy of most franchises in any year. Marino threw for more than 4,100 yards and 30 touchdowns, numbers that confirmed his status as the most prolific passer in the game. He was named to the Pro Bowl for the second consecutive year. He continued to fill highlight reels with throws that made defensive coordinators question their career choices. But in the playoffs, the pattern that would define the rest of his career began to take shape. The Dolphins lost in the AFC Championship game to the New England Patriots, a team that was not more talented than Miami, but that was more balanced. New England's defense harassed Marino throughout the game, and the Dolphins' running attack, which had been an afterthought all season, was completely neutralized. The final score was 31-14. Marino threw for 320 yards, an impressive total by any standard, but it was not enough. It was not enough because the rest of the team could not hold up its end of the bargain. This became the recurring and increasingly painful pattern of Marino's career. He would carry the offense on his shoulders week after week, producing statistics that were staggering by the standards of his era, and the team would advance deep enough into the playoffs to generate hope, only to fall short when it mattered most. The defense was almost always the problem. The Dolphins, under Shula and general manager Eddie Jones, invested heavily in the offensive side of the ball, surrounding Marino with talented pass catchers and giving him every tool he needed to succeed through the air. But they never built the kind of dominant, championship-caliber defense that the great teams of that era possessed. The 49ers had Ronnie Lott and a secondary that struck fear into opposing quarterbacks. The Giants had Lawrence Taylor and a pass rush that could single-handedly win games. The Bears had the 46 defense and a collection of defensive personalities who seemed to take personal offense at the notion that any opposing player might gain a yard. The Dolphins had none of these things. They had Dan Marino's arm, and that was supposed to be enough. Except it never was. Not in January. Not when it mattered most. The 1986 season brought another playoff appearance and another early exit, this time a first-round loss to the Cleveland Browns. The Dolphins finished 8-8 in 1987, a season that was shortened and disrupted by a players' strike that forced the league to use replacement players for 3 games. The strike of '87 was a contentious and bitter labor dispute that fractured locker rooms across the league, and the Dolphins were not immune to the turmoil. The season felt disjointed and incomplete, and when it was over, there was a lingering sense that something had been lost, not just in terms of wins and losses, but in terms of the team's identity and cohesion. 1988 was even worse. The Dolphins collapsed to 6-10, their worst record since Marino's arrival. The defense, which had been bad in previous years, became historically poor. Opponents ran and passed with equal ease against a unit that seemed to have no answers for anything. Marino, to his enormous credit, continued to perform at a high level despite the team's struggles. He threw for more than 4,400 yards, one of the highest totals in the league, and tossed 28 touchdowns. He was still, by any individual measure, one of the best quarterbacks in professional football. But individual excellence in a team sport is a peculiar and ultimately insufficient thing. A quarterback can throw for 500 yards and still lose the game if his defense cannot stop anyone. And that is precisely what happened to Marino with disheartening regularity during the late 1980s. One of the most memorable and bittersweet games of this period came on a Monday night in the fall of 1988. The Dolphins were playing the New York Jets at the old Orange Bowl, and the game was being broadcast on national television, as all Monday night football games were in that era. The country was watching. Marino was in vintage form. He was reading the Jets' defense as though he had written it himself, diagnosing coverages before the snap, and delivering the ball to receivers who seemed to be running in open space on every play. He threw for more than 500 yards that night, one of the highest single-game totals in league history up to that point. He was surgical, clinical, breathtaking. He dissected the Jets' secondary with a combination of deep strikes down the sideline and short, precise passes over the middle that accumulated yards in relentless bunches. The Dolphins won the game in convincing fashion, and Marino's performance was hailed as one of the greatest individual displays in the history of Monday Night Football. But the broader context told a different and more troubling story. The Dolphins were not a championship contender that year. They were not even a playoff team. They finished with a losing record, mired in mediocrity, despite having the most prolific passer in the game. And Marino's Monday night heroics, magnificent as they were, existed in a vacuum. They were individual achievements that did not translate into team success. They were records that filled stat sheets but not trophy cases. The applause faded, the highlights were filed away, and the fundamental problem remained unchanged. Dan Marino was a great quarterback on a team that was not great enough to win a championship. The numbers are striking when you examine them in full. Between 1984 and 1994, a span of 11 seasons that encompassed the prime of Marino's career, he threw for more than 42,000 yards. He threw more than 300 touchdown passes. He led the league in passing yards 5 times during that stretch. He led the league in touchdown passes 3 times. He was named to the Pro Bowl 8 times. He won the league's Most Valuable Player award. He set records that seemed unbreakable. And during that same 11-year stretch, the Miami Dolphins won exactly 0 conference championships. They appeared in the playoffs 7 times, but won only 3 playoff games in total across those 7 appearances. The most prolific passer in the history of the sport, the man who was rewriting the record books with every snap he took, was unable to translate his individual dominance into the kind of team success that defines a legacy in the public imagination. This is not to suggest that Marino was somehow to blame for the Dolphins' organizational shortcomings. He emphatically was not. The failure was systemic. It was structural. It was a failure of roster construction and resource allocation that began at the top of the organization and filtered down through every level of the team. The Dolphins front office, under Shula and general manager Eddie Jones, made a series of decisions throughout the late 1980s and early 1990s that prioritized short-term competitiveness over long-term sustainability. They traded away draft picks to acquire veteran players who were past their prime. They failed to develop young defensive talent through the draft. They allowed key players to leave in free agency without securing adequate replacements. And they built an offense that was so spectacularly, almost perversely dependent on Marino's arm that when the passing game struggled for any reason, whether because of injury, weather, or a particularly well-designed defensive scheme, there was no alternative plan, no plan B, no running game to lean on, no defensive identity to fall back on, just Marino, alone in the pocket, trying to will a flawed and incomplete team to victories it did not deserve. The Dolphins' running game during Marino's prime years was, by any standard, inadequate for a team with championship aspirations. During the entire decade of the 1980s, The Dolphins never had a single running back rush for more than 1,000 yards in a season, a benchmark that is considered the minimum standard of excellence for a feature back. The best rushing seasons were produced by committee efforts, with multiple backs splitting carries, and none establishing the kind of dominant ground presence that could keep defenses honest. Woody Bennett, Tony Nathan, Lorenzo Hampton, and later Sammy Smith and Bobby Humphrey all took turns as the primary ball carrier, but none of them were elite talents. None of them could command the attention of a defense the way a truly great running back could. And as a result, opposing defenses knew with virtual certainty that when they faced the Miami Dolphins, the ball was going to be in Dan Marino's hands. They could load the secondary. They could play extra defensive backs. They could drop 7 or even 8 men into coverage. And they did not have to worry about being punished by a running game that did not exist. This created a paradox that grew more pronounced as the years passed. Marino was so good at throwing the football that the Dolphins built their entire offensive identity around his arm. But because the identity was so one-dimensional, defenses could plan specifically for the passing attack without worrying about the run. This meant that even though Marino was the best passer in football, he was, in some respects, facing a more difficult task than quarterbacks on more balanced teams. When a defense knows that the quarterback is going to throw on almost every meaningful down, it can commit extra resources to defending the pass. It can play deeper. It can disguise coverages more effectively because it does not have to worry about honoring a running threat. And it can bring creative and disguised blitzes, knowing that there is no audible to a run play that will punish the defense for sending extra rushers. The defensive failures during this period were equally stark. The Dolphins' defense during Marino's prime ranked in the bottom half of the league more often than it ranked in the top half. In several seasons, it ranked among the worst in the entire NFL. The pass rush was chronically ineffective, generating sacks at a rate well below the league average. The secondary was vulnerable to big plays. The run defense was inconsistent at best. There were seasons when the Dolphins' defense allowed more points than any other team in their division. Seasons when opposing offenses scored seemingly at will against a unit that lacked playmakers, and at times appeared to lack effort. And through it all, Marino kept throwing, kept producing, kept putting up numbers that would have been the best in the league on almost any other team. He was bailing water out of a sinking ship with a teacup, and the fact that the ship stayed afloat as long as it did is a testament to the extraordinary volume of water he was able to move. The irony is deep and bitter. Marino's greatest strength, his otherworldly ability to carry an offense entirely through the air, may have actually worked against him in the broader context of his career. Because the Dolphins' coaching staff and front office knew they had Marino, they felt less urgency to build a balanced roster. The logic was seductive and, on the surface, reasonable. Why invest a first-round draft pick on a running back when you have the greatest passer in football? Why spend premium salary cap dollars on a defensive lineman when Marino can outscore any opponent? Why worry about balance and complementary football when you have a man who can throw for 5,000 yards in a single season? The reasoning made sense in the moment. It made sense on paper, but it was deeply, fundamentally, catastrophically flawed. Because football is not basketball, where a single transcendent individual can elevate an entire roster to championship level through the sheer force of his talent. Football requires depth. It requires balance. It requires excellence, or at least competence, on both sides of the ball. And the Dolphins, for all of Marino's brilliance, never achieved that balance. Not once in 17 years. The 1990 season brought one of the most painful and pivotal chapters in Marino's career. In a game against the Cleveland Browns, in the 5th week of the season, Marino planted his foot to throw a pass and felt something give way in his left leg. He collapsed to the turf, clutching his ankle, and the diagnosis was devastating: a torn Achilles tendon. One of the most serious injuries a professional athlete can suffer. The injury ended his season immediately and raised profound questions about whether he would ever return to his previous level of play. The Achilles tendon is the thick band of tissue that connects the calf muscle to the heel bone, and it is essential for virtually every movement an athlete makes. A torn Achilles robs the body of explosiveness, of the ability to push off and generate power from the lower extremities. For a quarterback like Marino, who was not mobile to begin with, and who relied on his ability to set his feet quickly and transfer energy from his legs, through his core and into his throwing arm, the injury posed a genuinely existential threat to his career. The rehabilitation was long and grueling. Marino spent months in physical therapy, rebuilding the strength in his leg, learning to trust the repaired tendon, gradually working his way back to the point where he could plant and throw without pain. It was monotonous, exhausting work, the kind of work that tests a man's patience and resolve far more than any fourth-quarter deficit ever could. There were days when the progress was imperceptible, days when the leg ached and the mind wandered to dark places, days when the question of whether it was worth it, whether the comeback was feasible, whether the body could ever again do what the mind demanded, must have seemed overwhelming. But Marino came back. He came back for the 1991 season with a determination that was palpable. He was not quite the same player he had been before the injury. There was a fraction of a second less zip on his deep throws. His footwork was slightly less fluid. The injury had taken something from him, something small but measurable, and he would never fully recover it. But he was still remarkably effective. He threw for more than 3,400 yards that year and led the Dolphins back to the playoffs, a return to post-season competition that felt, given what he had endured, like a triumph in itself. The following season, 1992, was one of the best of his entire career, and stands as perhaps the most compelling evidence of Marino's indomitable will. 2 years removed from a torn Achilles, he threw for 4,116 yards and 24 touchdowns. The Dolphins finished the regular season 11-5, a record that earned them a first-round bye in the playoffs. They hosted the San Diego Chargers in the divisional round, and Marino was magnificent. He threw for 322 yards and a touchdown in a commanding 31-0 shutout victory that sent a message to the rest of the league. Dan Marino was back. Dan Marino was healthy. Dan Marino was still, at the age of 31, one of the most dangerous quarterbacks in professional football. That victory set up an AFC Championship game against the Buffalo Bills at Joe Robbie Stadium in Miami. The Bills were led by Jim Kelly, one of the quarterbacks selected ahead of Marino in the 1983 draft, and they were in the midst of an unprecedented run of 4 consecutive Super Bowl appearances. The game represented, for Marino, the most significant opportunity he had been given since Super Bowl XIX, 8 long and frustrating years earlier. For the first time in nearly a decade, he was 1 game away from the Super Bowl, 1 victory away from a second chance at the prize that had eluded him. The atmosphere at Joe Robbie Stadium that afternoon was electric. The fans were desperate. The memories of 1984, of the loss to San Francisco, of all the near misses and early exits that had followed, hung over the stadium like a gathering storm. And once again, Marino fell short. The Bills won the game 29-10. It was not close after the first quarter. Buffalo's defense, led by Bruce Smith and Cornelius Bennett, harassed Marino throughout the afternoon, sacking him twice and forcing him into hurried, inaccurate throws. Kelly, playing on the road in front of a hostile crowd, was composed and efficient, managing the game with a calm that belied the pressure of the moment. The Bills controlled the ball, controlled the clock, and controlled the tempo in a way that kept Marino off the field for long stretches. And when Marino was on the field, the Bills' defense made certain that he could not establish the rhythm that made him so dangerous. They mixed their coverages. They disguised their blitzes. They took away the deep ball and forced Marino to settle for shorter, less impactful throws. It was a masterclass in defensive game planning, and Marino had no answers for it. The loss was crushing. Marino stood on the sideline in the fourth quarter, his jersey stained with grass and dirt, his face a mask of barely contained anguish, and watched as the clock ran down on what he must have known might be his last, best chance to reach the Super Bowl. He was 31 years old. His body had been through a devastating injury. The team around him was aging. and the window that had seemed so wide open just a few years earlier was now closing with a speed that must have been terrifying. That 1992 AFC Championship game loss haunted Marino for years. He spoke about it in interviews long after his career was over, and the pain in his voice was unmistakable even through the distance of time. He had been so close. He had played so well during the regular season. He had been brilliant in the divisional round. And then, when the biggest game of the year arrived, the team around him had crumbled once again. The defense could not contain the Bills' offense. The running game produced almost nothing, and Marino, for all his talent, for all his competitive fury, for all his desperate desire to win, could not overcome those deficiencies alone. No one could have. The mid-1990s brought a new set of challenges and frustrations. The NFL landscape was shifting rapidly. The salary cap, introduced in 1994, changed the economics of roster construction forever. Free agency had already begun to transform the way teams were built, and the cap accelerated that transformation. Teams could no longer simply retain their best players by outspending the competition. They had to make difficult choices about which players to keep and which to let go. The Dolphins, who had never been a model of smart roster management, struggled to adapt to this new reality. Key players left. Replacements were often inadequate, and the defense, which had been the team's Achilles heel for the better part of a decade, remained a chronic and seemingly incurable weakness. Marino continued to produce impressive numbers throughout this period. In 1994, he threw for 4,453 yards, the second highest total of his career, and tossed 30 touchdowns. He led the Dolphins to a 10-6 record and a playoff berth. In the divisional round, they traveled to San Diego to face the Chargers, and the game became one of the most heartbreaking entries in Marino's long catalogue of near misses. The Dolphins trailed by multiple scores in the second half, but mounted a furious comeback led by Marino's arm. He threw for more than 400 yards, including a late touchdown pass that briefly gave the Dolphins the lead in the fourth quarter. For a few glorious, breathless moments, it seemed as though Marino had done it. It seemed as though he had willed his team to a victory that logic and circumstance said was impossible. But the Chargers came back. They drove down the field in the final minutes, and the Dolphins' defense, once again, could not make the crucial stop. San Diego kicked a field goal as time expired and won the game 22-21. Marino walked off the field that afternoon with the vacant, shell-shocked expression of a man who was beginning to understand, with a terrible and bone-deep clarity, that some things are simply not meant to be. The 1995 season saw Marino's first coaching change as a professional. Don Shula, who had coached the Dolphins for 26 years and who had been the only head coach Marino had ever known in the NFL, retired after the season. His replacement was Jimmy Johnson, who had won 2 Super Bowls with the Dallas Cowboys and who brought a very different coaching philosophy to Miami. Johnson was a builder. He believed in acquiring draft picks, developing young talent, and constructing a complete roster rather than relying on a single superstar to carry the load. It was, in theory, exactly what the Dolphins needed. In practice, the transition was difficult. Johnson and Marino had very different temperaments and very different ideas about how an offense should operate. Johnson wanted balance. Marino wanted the ball. The tension between the two men was real, though both were too professional to let it become publicly destructive. The transition from Shula to Johnson was symbolic of a larger shift in the Dolphins' organizational philosophy. Shula had been a football man of the old school, a coach who valued loyalty and stability, and who believed in the power of relationships built over decades. His departure, while inevitable given his age and the team's declining performance, marked the end of an era in Miami. Johnson was a different kind of coach entirely. He was analytical where Shula was instinctive. He was ruthless in personnel decisions where Shula was sentimental. He believed in building through the draft and was willing to part with veteran players, even popular ones, if he felt they no longer served the team's long-term interests. The question was whether this new approach, applied to a franchise that had been built around a single aging superstar for more than a decade, could produce the championship that Shula had never been able to deliver. The answer, unfortunately, was no. Johnson made improvements to the roster, particularly on the defensive side of the ball. He drafted well in some years. He brought in free agents who added depth and toughness to a team that had lacked both for too long. But the improvements were incremental rather than transformative, and they could not overcome the fundamental problem that had plagued the Dolphins for more than a decade. The team was aging, and its best player, the one around whom everything was built, was aging fastest of all. Marino's body, after 15 years of professional football, was beginning to betray him in ways that were increasingly difficult to ignore. His knees required constant attention. His mobility, never his greatest attribute, was further reduced. The fastball that had once been the fastest in the league had lost several miles per hour of velocity, and while Marino compensated with guile and anticipation, there were plays, crucial plays in crucial moments, when the arm simply could not do what the mind was asking of it. Johnson's frustration with the situation was occasionally visible. He wanted to build for the future, but the organization and the fan base were still emotionally invested in the idea that Marino could deliver one more magical season, one more run to the Super Bowl. The tension between building for tomorrow and winning today is one of the oldest and most intractable problems in professional sports, and the Dolphins, during the late 1990s, were trapped in the worst version of that dilemma. They were too old and too limited to win a championship, but too proud and too attached to their legendary quarterback to blow it all up and start over. Johnson's tenure in Miami produced some improvement. The Dolphins made the playoffs in 1997 and 1998, and the defense, under Johnson's direction, showed signs of becoming a more competent unit. But the improvement was not dramatic enough, and it did not come quickly enough. Marino was aging. His body was breaking down. The arm that had been the most feared weapon in football was losing its legendary velocity. His knees ached constantly. His back protested against the accumulated punishment of more than a decade and a half of professional football. He was still effective, still capable of producing games and moments that reminded the world of his transcendent talent. But the frequency of those moments was diminishing, and the stretches between them were growing longer and more painful. One moment that captured the tension of Marino's final years came during a regular season game against the New England Patriots in 1998. The Dolphins were trailing in the fourth quarter, and Marino led them on a drive that seemed destined for the end zone. He completed several passes in succession, moving the ball downfield with something approaching the precision of his younger years. But on the crucial play, the play that would have given the Dolphins the lead, Marino's throw arrived a fraction of a second late. The ball was tipped at the line of scrimmage and intercepted. A younger Marino, the Marino of 1984, would have released that ball before the defender's hand was raised. The 1998 Marino could not. The difference was measured in milliseconds, but in professional football, milliseconds are everything. It was a small moment, unremarkable in the context of a long season, but it told the story of a career approaching its end. The final chapter of Marino's playing career came in the 1999 season. It was his 17th year in the league, a remarkably long career for a quarterback in any era, and it was clear to nearly everyone, including perhaps Marino himself, that the end was near. He threw for more than 3,700 yards that season, a total that would have been impressive for many quarterbacks in the prime of their careers. But for Marino, whose standard had always been set impossibly high, it felt diminished. The arm was functional, the mind was still sharp, the competitive desire still burned, but the body could no longer execute the commands that the mind was issuing, and the gap between intention and execution was widening with each passing week. The Dolphins made the playoffs as a wild-card team, and in the first round, they traveled to Jacksonville to face the Jaguars. The date was January 15th, 2000. The game was played at what was then known as Alltel Stadium, before a crowd that was overwhelmingly hostile to the visiting Dolphins. What followed was the most lopsided and humiliating defeat of Marino's professional career. The Jaguars won 62-7. 62-7. The score is worth repeating because of the sheer improbability of it. A team quarterbacked by Dan Marino, a team coached by Jimmy Johnson, a team with playoff aspirations and championship dreams, lost a postseason game by 55 points. It was the largest margin of victory in an NFL playoff game in more than 50 years. It was a catastrophe beyond description. Marino was pulled from the game in the third quarter, with the outcome long since decided. As he walked up to the sideline, the television cameras captured something that the football world had rarely, if ever, seen. They captured Dan Marino looking defeated, not angry, not frustrated, not defiant, defeated. The fire that had burned in his eyes for 17 years, the competitive fury that had driven him through 5,000-yard seasons and 400-yard games and countless comeback victories and devastating playoff losses, was finally, irrevocably, extinguished. He sat on the bench. He removed his helmet. He stared straight ahead with the hollow expression of a man who has given everything he has and knows, in his bones, that it is over. He retired a few months later, on a warm afternoon in March of 2000, at a press conference held at the Dolphins training facility in Davie, Florida. He wore a suit and tie. He was composed. He spoke calmly and clearly, with the measured dignity of a man who had made peace with a decision that must have been excruciating to reach. He thanked Don Shula, who had given him the opportunity to play professional football. He thanked Jimmy Johnson, who had tried to build a more complete team around him. He thanked the Marks brothers and all the receivers who had caught his passes over the years. He thanked the offensive linemen who had protected him, imperfectly but gamely, for 17 seasons. He thanked the city of Miami, which had adopted him as one of its own. And he thanked his family, Claire and the children, who had endured the emotional roller coaster of a career that was simultaneously magnificent and heartbreaking. He acknowledged, with an honesty that was admirable and quietly devastating, that the one thing he had wanted more than anything else in his career had eluded him. He had never won a Super Bowl. He had never held the Lombardi Trophy above his head. He had never felt the confetti fall on his shoulders at the end of a championship game. And now he never would. The dream was over, the chase was finished, and the ring finger remained bare. Throughout his career, Marino had rivalries that defined eras and fueled debates that continue to this day. His battles with John Elway were the most prominent, two gunslingers from the legendary 1983 draft class trading haymakers across the American Football Conference for more than 15 years. Elway had the athleticism that Marino lacked, the ability to extend plays with his legs, the gift for improvisation that allowed him to escape collapsing pockets and throw on the run. Marino had the arm that Elway could not match, the release speed that was faster than anything in the league, the ability to stand flat-footed in the pocket and deliver the ball to its target before the rush could arrive. They were opposite archetypes. Two different visions of what a great quarterback could be, and their rivalry was a source of endless, passionate, and often heated debate among football fans who could not agree on which vision was superior. The debate was never definitively resolved during their playing careers, and perhaps it never will be. But Elway eventually won 2 Super Bowls at the end of his career, in 1997 and 1998. And those championships, as much as any statistical comparison, tilted the argument in his favour in the minds of many analysts and fans. Elway finished with rings. Marino finished without one. And in a sport that measures its greatest figures by championships above all else, that distinction carried enormous weight. Marino's rivalry with Jim Kelly was different in nature, but no less significant. It was personal and geographic. Kelly had been drafted ahead of Marino in 1983, and the two competed against each other within the AFC East Division multiple times a year for more than a decade. Kelly's Bills went to 4 consecutive Super Bowls between 1990 and 1993, losing all 4 in a streak of heartbreak that in some ways mirrored Marino's own frustrations. But Kelly at least had the opportunities. He at least had 4 chances to compete on the biggest stage, to stand in the arena and fight for the ultimate prize. Marino had been there only once, and that single opportunity had ended in a rout. And then there was the comparison that was not a rivalry in the traditional competitive sense, but which defined Marino's career and legacy more profoundly than any other. The comparison with Joe Montana. Montana, who had beaten Marino in Super Bowl XIX, went on to win 4 championships during his career with the San Francisco 49ers. He compiled a perfect 4-0 record in Super Bowls. He was named the game's most valuable player 3 times. He was cool where Marino was intense. He was efficient where Marino was explosive. He played in a system specifically designed to maximize his strengths, while Marino often played in offenses that simply asked him to throw the ball as much and as far as he could. Montana had Bill Walsh. Marino had Don Shula, who was a great coach by any standard, but who never built the kind of complete multi-dimensional team that Walsh constructed in San Francisco. The comparison between Marino and Montana was, in many important respects, unfair. It compared a quarterback who had ideal supporting conditions with a quarterback who spent most of his career compensating for organizational deficiencies. But the comparison was inescapable, and the conclusion that most observers drew from it, that Montana was greater because he won more championships, haunted Marino for the rest of his career and beyond. There is a question that lingers beneath the surface of every conversation about Dan Marino, a question that most people are too polite to ask directly, but that everyone who has followed his career has considered at some point during a quiet moment of reflection. The question is not whether Marino was great. That was settled long ago, settled beyond any reasonable dispute by a body of work that speaks for itself in the cold, unambiguous language of numbers. The question is different and more unsettling. It is the question of whether Marino's career represents a tragedy or a triumph, whether the absence of a championship ring diminishes his legacy or, paradoxically, enhances it by transforming him into something more complex and more human than a simple winner. Whether the greatest quarterback without a title is a figure to be pitied or a figure to be admired for the purity and persistence of his individual achievement in the face of forces he could not control. The answer, as with most things that matter in life, is more complicated than most people want it to be. The answer resists the clean narratives and tidy conclusions that we prefer when we talk about sports and the people who play them. Let that sink in. A man who threw for 61,361 career yards, who threw 420 career touchdown passes, who held virtually every significant passing record in the National Football League when he retired in the year 2000, is defined in the public imagination not by what he accomplished, but by what he did not accomplish. The frame that has been placed around his career, the frame through which almost every discussion of his legacy is conducted, is not a frame of achievement, but a frame of absence. The story of Dan Marino, as it is told in sports bars and on television broadcasts, and in the pages of football histories, and in the endless debates that fill the internet, is not primarily a story about a man who did remarkable, unprecedented, historically significant things with a football in his hands. It is primarily a story about a man who did not win a championship, and that framing, that persistent and perhaps unfair emphasis on the thing that is missing, rather than the mountain of things that are present, tells us something important, not just about Dan Marino, but about the way we think about greatness and meaning and value in American sports. We have a deep and perhaps irresistible tendency in this culture to reduce complex careers to simple narratives. We want our heroes to win. We want the story to end with a trophy and a parade and confetti falling from the sky, and a man standing on a stage with the world watching, holding a championship above his head while the crowd roars its approval. We want the final chapter to be one of triumph, of vindication, of struggle rewarded and perseverance redeemed. And when the story does not end that way, when the final scene is one of quiet departure and unfulfilled longing, when the man walks off the field for the last time without the trophy he spent his career chasing, we do not know quite what to do with it. We categorize it as failure, or at least as incompleteness. We attach an asterisk to the legacy. We say things like, yes, he was brilliant, but he never won the big one, as if the big one is the only thing that matters, as if 17 years of extraordinary play, of record-breaking performances, of autumn afternoons when a man threw a football with more skill and beauty than anyone who had ever done it before, are somehow rendered meaningless or insufficient by the absence of a single victory in a single game on a single February afternoon. Let that sink in. The greatest passer of his generation perhaps the greatest pure passer who has ever lived, walked away from the game with records that seemed unbreakable and a reputation that was somehow, in the judgment of many, incomplete. And the reason it was considered incomplete had almost nothing to do with his individual performance. It had to do with the performance of the men around him, the teammates who could not stop opposing offenses, the front office executives who could not build a balanced roster, the coaching decisions that prioritized offense over defense to a degree that bordered on recklessness, and the unpredictable, chaotic, deeply random forces that determine the outcome of any given football game, forces that no single player, no matter how brilliantly talented, can fully control or overcome. The truth about Dan Marino, the deeper truth that gets lost in the endless and circular debates about rings and rankings and all-time quarterback lists, is that he was a man who gave everything he had to a sport that could not give him what he wanted most. He did not hold back. He did not coast through seasons when the team was clearly not good enough to contend. He did not take plays off or lose interest or go through the motions when the record slipped below 500 and the playoffs became a mathematical impossibility. He showed up every single Sunday for 17 years and competed with a ferocity and a focus and an unyielding intensity that few athletes in any sport have ever sustained over such a long period. He played through injuries that would have sidelined lesser men. He came back from a torn Achilles tendon that might have ended most careers. He endured losing seasons and heartbreaking playoff exits and the slow, grinding, merciless erosion of his physical abilities with a dignity and a quiet determination that was, in its own understated way, more impressive than any fourth-quarter comeback. The man behind the legend was not so different from the player on the field. Marino was, by virtually all accounts from those who knew him, a straightforward and unpretentious person. He did not seek attention for its own sake. He did not cultivate a carefully constructed public persona designed to sell products or attract endorsement deals. He was not interested in being a celebrity, though celebrity found him whether he wanted it or not. He was a family man who married his high school sweetheart Claire, and together they raised 6 children. He was devoted to his family in a way that was unusual for a man of his fame, wealth, and professional stature. He attended his children's school events and sporting activities. He was present for dinner. He did the ordinary, unglamorous, unheralded work of fatherhood with the same dedication and consistency that he brought to studying game film and preparing for opponents. His teammates spoke of a man who was demanding but fair, intense but kind, competitive but generous. He expected excellence from those around him because he demanded it from himself, and the standard he set was not arbitrary or cruel. It was simply the natural expression of a man who took his craft seriously and believed that every person on the field had an obligation to give his best. But there was a cost to his career, a profound and lasting physical cost that is not always visible in the statistics or the highlight reels or the bronze bust in Canton, Ohio. The toll of 17 NFL seasons on the human body is immense. Marino was sacked more than 270 times during his career. 270 times he was driven to the ground by men who weighed 250, 270, sometimes 300 pounds. Men whose sole objective on each play was to reach the quarterback and bring him down with as much force as possible. He absorbed countless additional hits, many of them after the ball had already left his hand, hits that were technically legal under the rules of that era, but that left their mark on his body nonetheless. His knees deteriorated over the course of his career. His back ached chronically. His shoulders bore the physical memory of tens of thousands of throws, each one exacting a small but cumulative toll on the muscles and tendons and ligaments that had made his arm the most feared weapon in professional football. By the end of his career, Marino was playing in constant, unrelenting pain. He has spoken in interviews conducted years after his retirement about the physical challenges he faces in his daily life, about the difficulty of performing ordinary tasks that most people take for granted. Getting out of bed in the morning, walking upstairs, playing with his grandchildren. The price of greatness, it turns out, is not merely metaphorical. It is not merely a subject for philosophical reflection or poetic musing. It is real. It is physical. It is written on the body in a language of aches and stiffness and limitation that speaks more eloquently than any words about the true cost of a career spent at the highest level of a violent sport. And the truth gets heavier when you consider what Marino sacrificed emotionally. He has spoken, in rare and unguarded moments during interviews, about the frustration of knowing that his career would always be defined by the championships he did not win. He has acknowledged, with a candor that is both admirable and painful to witness, the sting of watching other quarterbacks, some of whom he demonstrably outperformed on every individual statistical measure available, celebrated as champions and all-time greats, while he was cast as a brilliant but ultimately incomplete figure. He has lived with that narrative for more than 2 decades since his retirement, and while he has handled it with grace and humor and the kind of quieter resilience that defined his career, it would be naive to suggest that it has not affected him at some deep and private level. No one who competes at the highest level of professional athletics, no one who dedicates their life to the single-minded pursuit of excellence in their chosen field can be entirely unmoved by the knowledge that the ultimate prize, the one thing that the world uses to separate the great from the greatest, forever eluded their grasp. There is another dimension to the Marino story that deserves careful consideration, one that is rarely discussed in the standard accounts of his career and legacy. It is the dimension of loyalty. Dan Marino played his entire career with one team, the Miami Dolphins, 17 seasons, one franchise, one city, one uniform. In an era when free agency was transforming the landscape of professional sports, when players were increasingly willing and even eager to move from team to team in search of better opportunities, bigger contracts, and a greater chance at a championship, Marino stayed. He stayed through the winning seasons and the losing ones. He stayed when the defense was terrible and the front office seemed incapable of fixing it. He stayed when other quarterbacks with less arm talent and smaller statistical resumes were being handed championship-caliber rosters by more competent and more visionary organizations. Why did he stay? The easy and cynical answer is money. The Dolphins paid Marino well, and he was compensated handsomely for his services over the course of 17 seasons. But money alone does not explain that kind of loyalty. Money alone does not account for a man who stays with a franchise through 15 years of championship drought when he knows, with absolute certainty, that his talent is being wasted by an organization that cannot build a complete team around him. The deeper answer, the one that gets closer to the truth of who Dan Marino was as a person, is that he stayed because loyalty was woven into the fabric of his identity. He was a man from a working-class neighborhood in Pittsburgh, a man who had been raised by a newspaper delivery driver who went to work every morning regardless of how he felt, a man who had grown up in a community that valued commitment and perseverance and the quiet honor of keeping one's word above almost everything else. He had committed to the Dolphins. He had given them his arm and his mind and his competitive spirit, and he intended to see that commitment through to its conclusion, regardless of the cost. It was admirable. It was deeply, profoundly human, and it may have cost him the championship he spent his career chasing. One of the most revealing moments in Marino's post-playing career came during his Pro Football Hall of Fame induction ceremony in August of 2005. He stood at the podium in Canton, Ohio, wearing the gold jacket that signifies membership in football's most exclusive fraternity, and he spoke about his career with a mixture of pride and wistfulness that was deeply moving. He talked about his teammates, the men who had lined up beside him on Sundays, and who had shared in both the triumphs and the disappointments. He talked about Don Shula, the man who had believed in him when 26 other teams had not. He talked about the city of Miami, which had embraced him and made him one of its own. He talked about Claire and his children, and about the love and support they had given him through every season, through every game, through every moment of joy and despair that a career in professional football inevitably produces. And he talked, briefly and with characteristic understatement, about the championship that had eluded him. He did not dwell on it. He did not make excuses. He did not blame his teammates, or his coaches, or the front office, or the fates. He simply acknowledged it as a fact of his career, a piece of the puzzle that was missing and would always be missing, and then he moved on to what he clearly considered more important things. The relationships he had built, the memories he had created, the life he had lived beyond the white lines of a football field. That speech revealed something essential about the man behind the statistics and the records and the debates. It revealed a man who had found a way to make peace with his legacy, imperfect as it was. A man who understood, perhaps more clearly than any of his critics ever could, that a life spent in football is measured not by a single game or a single trophy, but by the entirety of the experience. The tens of thousands of passes thrown, the hundreds of games played, the countless hours of preparation and practice and rehabilitation, the friendships forged in the crucible of competition, the lessons learned in victory and defeat alike. These things, taken together, formed the true fabric of a career that was anything but incomplete. What does Dan Marino mean to the game of football today? It is a question worth pausing over, worth sitting with for a long moment of genuine reflection, because the answer is not as straightforward as it might initially seem. In the years since Marino's retirement, in the spring of 2000, the National Football League has undergone a transformation so sweeping and so fundamental that the game he played during his prime would be almost unrecognizable to a fan watching a modern broadcast. The rules have changed dramatically, favoring the passing attack to a degree that would have seemed inconceivable during the 1980s. Defenders can no longer make contact with receivers beyond 5 yards from the line of scrimmage without being penalized. Quarterbacks are protected by an increasingly elaborate web of rules that make it virtually illegal to hit them with any significant force. Roughing the passer penalties are called with a frequency that would have bewildered the pass rushers of Marino's era, men who were accustomed to hitting the quarterback hard and often without consequence. The salary cap has created a degree of competitive parity that ensures no team can maintain a dynasty through the simple accumulation of superior talent. And the result of all these changes, taken together, is a league in which passing numbers that would have been considered historically extraordinary in Marino's time are now produced by half a dozen quarterbacks every season. Consider the specific ways in which Marino's records have been surpassed. His single-season record of 48 touchdown passes, which stood as the gold standard for 2 full decades, was broken by Peyton Manning in 2004 when Manning threw 49. Manning then obliterated that record in 2013 by throwing 55 touchdowns in a single season. Marino's career passing yardage total of 61,361 yards has been surpassed by multiple quarterbacks, including Tom Brady, Drew Brees, Peyton Manning, and Brett Favre. His career touchdown total of 420 has likewise been exceeded. The 5,000-yard season which Marino accomplished first, and which seemed like an unreachable mountain when he did it in 1984, has been reached by several quarterbacks in the modern game. The statistical benchmarks that once defined Marino's legacy, the numbers that were cited as proof of his unprecedented brilliance, have been eclipsed by a generation of passers playing in a league that is explicitly designed to produce exactly those kinds of numbers. And yet Marino's legacy endures with a tenacity that cannot be explained by statistics alone. It endures because the people who watched him play, the coaches and teammates and opponents and analysts and fans who saw him in his prime, understand something that the raw numbers cannot fully convey. They understand that Marino was not merely a product of his era. He was decades ahead of it. He was doing things in 1984 that the rest of the league would not begin to replicate until the 2000s. He was throwing for 5,000 yards in a season, when the rules were stacked against the passing game, when defensive backs could physically manhandle receivers, when pass rushers could hit the quarterback with impunity, when offensive linemen were smaller and less skilled than their modern counterparts. He was releasing the ball in under 2 seconds when no defensive coordinator in the league had any idea how to account for that kind of speed. He was, in the truest and most profound sense, a man who was playing a different and more advanced version of the game than everyone else on the field. This is the enduring heart of Marino's legacy, not the records themselves, which have fallen as the game has evolved and the rules have tilted in favor of the offense, not the individual awards, which have faded in the collective memory as new stars have risen and new narratives have taken hold, but the way he played the game, the artistry of his mechanics, the elegance of his release, the breathtaking and almost otherworldly beauty of watching a man throw a football with an ease and precision that made the most difficult task in all of professional sports look simple and natural and inevitable. That is what the older generation of football fans remembers when they hear the name Dan Marino. That is what coaches still reference, decades later, when they talk about the ideal quarterback. That is what survives the passage of time and the breaking of records and the fading of memory. There is a philosophical dimension to Marino's legacy that deserves exploration. It is the question of what constitutes true greatness in a team sport, a question that has no easy answer and that provokes genuine and passionate disagreement among thoughtful people. The conventional answer, the answer that dominates most public discussions of quarterback rankings and all-time lists, is that championships are the ultimate measure of greatness. This view holds that a quarterback's legacy is determined, above all else, by the number of championship rings he has earned, by the number of times he has stood on the biggest stage and delivered a victory for his team and his city and his franchise. By this standard, Marino falls short. He ranks below Montana, below Brady, below Elway, below Bradshaw, below every quarterback in the history of the game who managed to win at least one Super Bowl. But there is another way of evaluating greatness, one that separates individual excellence from team achievement and asks a different set of questions. Not did he win, but rather how well did he play? Not how many rings does he have, but rather how much mastery did he display over the craft of quarterbacking? By this alternative standard, Marino stands with anyone who has ever played the position. His arm talent was unmatched in his era and arguably in any era. His football intelligence, his ability to read defenses and process information and make decisions under pressure was exceptional by any standard. His release speed was faster than anyone else's, before or since. He was not a perfect quarterback. He could not run. He occasionally forced throws into coverage that a more conservative quarterback would have abandoned. He could be stubborn in his refusal to check down to a shorter route when the deep ball was not available. But his flaws were minor imperfections on a masterwork, and his gifts were of a quality and a magnitude that the game had never seen before and has rarely seen since. There is a school of thought that holds Marino's career in higher regard precisely because of the championship he did not win. This view argues that Marino's statistics are more impressive, not less, because he compiled them without the benefit of a complete supporting cast. Montana had Jerry Rice, the greatest receiver in history. Elway had Terrell Davis, one of the greatest postseason running backs ever, for his 2 championship runs. Bradshaw had the steel curtain defense. Troy Aikman had Emmitt Smith and Michael Irvin and a dominant offensive line. These quarterbacks won championships in part because they were surrounded by other exceptional players who carried a significant portion of the burden. Marino had no such luxury. His supporting cast, while not devoid of talent, never approached the level of the rosters that supported the game's championship quarterbacks, and yet his statistics exceeded most of theirs. His individual production, measured in yards and touchdowns, and completion percentage and passer rating, was equal to or better than the production of quarterbacks who are ranked above him on most all-time lists. The implication is clear and provocative. If Marino had been placed on one of those championship teams, if he had been given the defense and the running game and the coaching staff that Montana or Elway or Bradshaw enjoyed, his career might look very different today. He might have multiple rings. He might be universally recognized as the greatest quarterback of all time. He might be the standard against which all others are measured. But he was not placed on one of those teams. He was placed on the Miami Dolphins, a franchise that could not build a complete roster around him, despite having 17 years to do so. And so the question persists. Is Marino penalized for circumstances beyond his control? Is the absence of a championship ring a fair reflection of his ability, or is it a reflection of his organization's failure? The debate will never be settled, because it rests on counterfactuals that can never be tested. But it is a debate worth having, because it forces us to think carefully about what we mean when we say that one quarterback is greater than another. Do we mean that he won more games, or do we mean that he played the position at a higher level? These are not the same question, and Dan Marino's career is the most powerful illustration of that distinction in the history of professional football. What we lost when Dan Marino retired was not merely a great quarterback, of whom the sport produces several in every generation. We lost a connection to a style of play that valued artistry over athleticism, that prized the beauty of a perfect spiral over the spectacle of a scrambling quarterback running for his life behind a broken offensive line. We lost a daily, living, breathing reminder that the quarterback position, at its highest expression, is as much an art as it is a science, as much a matter of touch and feel and instinct as it is a matter of arm strength and physical ability. And we lost an example, rare and perhaps irreplaceable, of what it looks like when a man dedicates his entire professional life to the mastery of a single skill and achieves something that approaches, as closely as human endeavor can, a state of perfection. Marino stood in the pocket, he planted his feet, he set his shoulders, and he threw the football with a quickness and an accuracy and a beauty that still takes the breath away when you watch the old film. He did not need to run. He did not need to scramble. He did not need to improvise or extend plays or make something out of nothing with his legs. He just needed to throw. And nobody who has ever played the game of football, at any level, at any time, in any era, threw it better than Dan Marino. There is a quiet sadness to the story of Dan Marino. It is not the sharp, acute sadness of a sudden loss or a catastrophic failure. It is something slower and more pervasive. It is the accumulating sadness of a life spent reaching for something that was always just slightly, cruelly, impossibly beyond the fingertips. It is the sadness of a man who did everything within his power to achieve a goal and came up short, not because of any flaw in his effort or his talent or his dedication, but because of forces that existed beyond the boundaries of his control. It is, in many ways, the most human and universal kind of sadness there is. Marino's career lasted 17 seasons in the National Football League. That is a long time to play professional football. It is a long time to absorb the hits and endure the physical punishment of a sport that consumes the bodies of those who play it with an appetite that is almost frightening. It is a long time to wake up on Monday mornings with a body that aches in ways that the average person cannot comprehend, with joints that creak and muscles that protest, and a back that feels decades older than the calendar says it should be. It is a long time to carry the weight of an entire franchise's expectations on our shoulders, to feel the eyes of an entire city watching your every throw, to know that every decision you make, every ball you release, every audible you call at the line of scrimmage is being judged and measured and weighed against an impossible standard of perfection. And it is a very long time to live with the knowledge, growing more certain and more painful with each passing year, that the one thing you want most in the world, the one achievement that would complete your legacy and quiet the critics, and answer the question that has followed you since the age of 23, is slipping further and further and further beyond your reach. But here is the thing about Dan Marino that gets lost in the discussions about rings and rankings and all-time quarterback lists. He was magnificent. Not in spite of the championship he did not win, but completely independent of it. His magnificence was not contingent on a trophy or a parade or a confetti-strewn stage. It was intrinsic. It was fundamental. It was built into every throw he ever made, into every defense he ever dissected, into every game he ever played. It was present on the days when the Dolphins won by 30 and on the days when they lost by 7. It was present on the nights when the Orange Bowl was full and roaring and on the afternoons when the stands were half empty and the season was already lost. His brilliance did not depend on the outcome. It existed on its own terms, in its own right, as a thing of beauty and power and quiet grace. He was the finest passer of his generation. There are those, and they are not a small number, who would argue that he was the finest passer of any generation. He set records that stood for decades. He changed the way coaches thought about the quarterback position and about the possibilities of the passing game. He expanded the boundaries of what was considered achievable for a man standing behind center with a football in his hands. He did these things in the harsh, unforgiving, relentless glare of the professional spotlight, in an era when the rules of the game made passing harder, not easier, when defensive backs could maul receivers at the line of scrimmage and linebackers could launch themselves at quarterbacks without fear of a flag. Dan Marino never won a Super Bowl. That fact is part of his story. It is an element of his legacy that cannot be ignored or wished away. But it is not the whole story. It is not even the most important or most meaningful part of the story. The most important part of the story is that a young man from a working-class neighborhood in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, the son of a newspaper delivery driver who rose before dawn every morning, walked onto a professional football field at the age of 22 and proceeded to throw a football with more natural ability, more instinctive brilliance, more sheer God-given talent than anyone who had ever played the game before him. He did it for 17 years. He did it through a torn Achilles tendon and losing seasons and heartbreaking playoff defeats and the slow, relentless erosion of his body. He did it with a dedication that never wavered and a passion that never dimmed. Even when the results did not match the effort, even when the team could not match the man, even when the universe seemed determined to deny him the one thing he wanted most. And when it was over, when the last pass had been thrown, and the last game had been played, and the last whistle had blown, he walked away from the field with his head held high, and his records intact, and his conscience clear. He had given everything he had. He had left nothing on the field. He had played the game the only way he knew how to play it, with total commitment and an uncompromising pursuit of excellence in every throw, every read, every decision. And if the final trophy case was missing one particular piece of hardware, well, that was not a reflection of what Dan Marino was. It was a reflection of what the game of football is. Unpredictable, unfair, beautiful, brutal, and ultimately, impossibly, beyond the control of any single man. No matter how great his arm or how fierce his will, he could not control the defense. He could not control the running game. He could not control the draft picks, or the free agent signings, or the coaching decisions that shaped the roster around him. He could not control the injuries that struck at the worst possible moments, or the bounces of the ball that went the wrong way on the wrong day. He could only control the one thing he had always controlled, the thing that defined him from the first time he picked up a football in a backyard in Oakland, Pittsburgh, to the last time he released a spiral into the warm Miami air. The ball in his hands, the decision in his mind, the throw. And the throw was perfect, every time, or as close to perfection as any human being has ever come or ever will. That is the legacy of Dan Marino. Not the ring he never won, but the arm he always possessed. Not the championship that eluded him, but the artistry that defined him. Not the single absence at the center of his career, but the overwhelming abundance that surrounded it on every side. 61,000 yards, 420 touchdowns, 17 seasons, one team, one city, one man. The greatest quarterback who never won a championship was, in every other meaningful way, perhaps the greatest quarterback who ever lived. And if there is a lesson in that, if there is something lasting and true to be drawn from the long, brilliant, and quietly heartbreaking career of Daniel Constantine Marino Jr., it is this. Greatness is not a destination. It is not a trophy or a ring or a banner hanging from the rafters of a stadium. Greatness is a practice. It is something you do every day with every ounce of effort and concentration and love you possess, regardless of whether the world sees fit to reward you for it. Dan Marino practiced greatness every single day he stepped onto a football field. And the fact that the ultimate reward, the championship ring, never found its way onto his finger does not diminish what he accomplished. If anything, it makes his story more resonant, more affecting, more deeply human. It makes his career something that any person, in any walk of life, who has ever poured their heart into a pursuit and come up short of the final prize, can look at and understand and draw strength from. Some men chase perfection and catch it in their hands. Some men chase perfection and watch it slip through their fingers. And some men chase perfection with such devotion, such skill, such relentless and beautiful purpose, that the chase itself becomes the most magnificent achievement of all. Dan Marino threw a football better than anyone who has ever lived, and the fact that it was not enough tells you everything you need to know about the beautiful, cruel, impossibly complicated, and endlessly fascinating game he loved. The sun sets over Miami. The old Orange Bowl is gone now, demolished years ago and replaced by a parking lot and the fading echoes of 1,000 autumn afternoons. The aqua and white jersey hangs in a glass case at the Pro Football Hall of Fame in Canton, Ohio, beside the jerseys of the men he was compared to, and the men he surpassed, and the men who beat him on the day that mattered most. The arm is still now. The records have been broken. The debates continue in bars and living rooms and on late-night sports broadcasts across the country, and they will continue for as long as people care about football and the men who played it. But the memory remains. The image of a man standing tall in the pocket, his eyes scanning the field with calm, unshakable focus, his arm cocked back with the ease of a man performing the most natural act in the world, the ball spiraling through the warm South Florida air toward a receiver running free down the sideline. That image will never fade. That image is football at its purest and most beautiful. That image is Dan Marino. And that image, more than any championship ring, more than any trophy, more than any argument about rankings and legacies, and who belongs above whom on a list that will never be settled, is the truest and most lasting measure of what he meant to the game and to the millions of people who watched him play it. A perfect throw, a perfect spiral, a man doing the thing he was born to do, with all the skill and all the heart and all the quiet, unbreakable grace that a human being can bring to bear. That is all there ever was. That is all there ever needed to be.